The Rolls-Royce pulled up behind the dumpster where 23-year-old Dominique slept every night. The window rolled down, and an elderly woman in diamonds asked one question. "Where's the BMW I bought you 3 years ago?" Dominique couldn't speak. She just lifted her shirt and showed the scars. It was early morning in West End Atlanta, and the garbage trucks were already rumbling down the street. Rats scattered as the Rolls-Royce Phantom came to a stop in a neighborhood where cars like that didn't belong. The driver stayed behind the wheel, but the back door opened, and out stepped Lorraine Washington. She was 68 years old, draped in a cream Chanel suit, and her diamonds caught the first light of dawn. Next to her stood Jerome, her private investigator, a man who'd spent 3 years chasing ghosts and dead ends. He pointed toward the dumpster behind a closed grocery store, and Lorraine's breath caught in her throat. There, curled up under a filthy donated coat, surrounded by plastic bags that held everything she owned, was a young woman who looked more like a skeleton than a human being. Her hair was matted, her face was covered in dirt, and her body was so thin that her bones pressed against her skin like they were trying to escape. Lorraine took 3 steps forward and whispered a name she'd been screaming into the void for 3 years. Dominique Elise Washington. The girl's eyes snapped open, wild and terrified, like an animal caught in a trap. She scrambled backward, clutching her plastic bags to her chest, ready to run. She'd learned that people who came looking for her usually meant trouble. Police who didn't believe her story, predators looking for easy prey, or just cruel strangers who wanted to remind her that she didn't belong anywhere. But then she heard that voice again, softer this time, breaking with emotion. "Baby, it's me. It's grandmother." Dominique froze. Her mind couldn't process what her eyes were seeing. Lorraine Washington, the billionaire real estate mogul who owned half of Atlanta, was standing 10 feet away from her, with tears streaming down her face. For 3 years, Dominique had convinced herself that her grandmother had forgotten about her, that she'd believed the lies, that she'd moved on. The shame of that belief had been almost as painful as the hunger. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a broken whisper. "You're really here?" Lorraine closed the distance between them in seconds, and before Dominique could protest, she was wrapped in her grandmother's arms. The smell of expensive perfume mixed with the stench of the streets, and Dominique broke. She sobbed into Lorraine's shoulder like a child, 3 years of pain pouring out in waves that shook her entire body. Lorraine held her tighter, whispering prayers and promises into her granddaughter's hair. Jerome stood back, giving them space, but his jaw was clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter. He'd seen a lot of things in his 20 years as an investigator, but nothing had prepared him for this. When Lorraine finally pulled back, she cupped Dominique's face in her hands and asked the question that would unravel everything. "Baby, where's the BMW I bought you? The white one I gave you for your 16th birthday?" It was an innocent question, born from confusion and concern. Lorraine still didn't know the full story. She'd been searching for 3 years, following leads that went nowhere, filing missing persons reports that gathered dust, and spending 6 figures on private investigators who kept coming back empty-handed. All she knew was that her granddaughter had disappeared 2 weeks after her son Raymond's funeral, and the step-family claimed she'd run away with a drug dealer. Dominique's face crumpled. The shame was so overwhelming that she couldn't form words. How could she explain what had happened? How could she tell her grandmother that she'd lost everything, the car, the money, the education, the future, not through her own choices, but through a betrayal so calculated that it still didn't feel real? Instead of speaking, Dominique did something that would haunt Lorraine for the rest of her life. With trembling hands, she lifted the oversized coat and then the dirty shirt underneath. Her torso was a map of violence. Cigarette burns formed patterns across her ribs, some old and scarred, others still pink and healing. Knife wounds crisscrossed her abdomen like someone had been using her as a practice canvas. Belt welts wrapped around her back and sides, and you could see the bumps where ribs had broken and healed wrong without medical attention. Lorraine gasped and covered her mouth, staggering backward like she'd been hit. Jerome turned away, his hands balling into fists, and Dominique, standing there exposed and vulnerable, whispered the words that would change everything. Aunt Phyllis said you didn't want me anymore. She took everything, the car, the money, the house. Then she couldn't finish. She didn't need to. Lorraine's grief transformed into something cold and lethal. She wrapped the coat back around Dominique's shaking body and turned to Jerome with eyes that could cut steel. Get her to the car. Call Dr. Mitchell and tell him we're coming to the hospital. And Jerome, find me everything on Phyllis Washington. Bank records, phone records, security footage, criminal history, parking tickets. I want every breath that woman has taken for the last 3 years documented and on my desk by tomorrow morning. To understand how Dominique ended up behind that dumpster, you have to go back 4 years to when life was so different that it felt like a dream from someone else's life. Back then, Dominique was 19 years old, vibrant and beautiful, with a smile that could light up a room and a future so bright it hurt to look at directly. She lived in a Buckhead mansion with 8 bedrooms, a pool, a tennis court, and enough space that you could go days without seeing another person if you wanted to. The house had been in the Washington family for 2 generations, built with money that Lorraine and her late husband had earned through blood, sweat, and a refusal to accept the limitations that society tried to place on black people in the South. Dominique's father, Raymond Washington, was Lorraine's only son, and he'd followed in his mother's footsteps by building his own commercial real estate development company. He was 45 years old, successful, handsome, and devoted to his daughter in a way that made other fathers jealous. Dominique had been raised by Raymond alone because her mother, Chantal, had died giving birth to her. It was a tragedy that Raymond carried with grace, never making Dominique feel guilty for surviving, always making sure she knew how much her mother had wanted her. The 3 of them, Lorraine, Raymond, and Dominique, formed a tight unit that felt unbreakable. Summers were spent at Washington Properties headquarters, where Lorraine would teach Dominique about business, about negotiation, about the importance of owning land in a country that had spent centuries denying black people that right. Lorraine would sit behind her massive desk with Dominique in the chair across from her and say things like, "Never forget where you came from, baby. I grew up in Mechanicsville with nothing. Your grandfather and I built this empire with our own hands, and nobody can take that away from us. That's what ownership means. That's what legacy means." Dominique absorbed every word like gospel. She was brilliant, a 4.0 student at the prestigious Lovett School, a young woman who dreamed of becoming a pediatric surgeon because she wanted to help children who looked like her, children who deserved the best medical care regardless of their zip code. When she got accepted to Spelman College with a full academic scholarship, Lorraine threw a party that had half of Atlanta's black elite in attendance. The pride in that room was thick enough to choke on, and on Dominique's 16th birthday, Lorraine had given her a white BMW with a giant red bow and an engraved keychain that read, "Drive toward your dreams, grandmother." Dominique had cried so hard that her makeup ran, and Raymond had stood there, beaming like his heart might burst. That car was more than transportation. It was a symbol of everything they'd built together, everything they believed in, everything they were fighting to preserve. But then, 2 years later, when Dominique was 18 and freshly enrolled at Spelman, Raymond met a woman named Phyllis Turner at a charity auction at the Atlanta Botanical Garden. Phyllis was 39 years old, divorced, and she had 2 daughters from her previous marriage. She worked as an administrative assistant and presented herself as a woman who was cultured, educated, and refined despite her financial struggles. She talked about how hard it was raising two girls alone, how she wanted to give them opportunities but could barely keep the lights on some months. Raymond, who understood single parenting intimately, felt sympathetic. He saw a woman who was doing her best against difficult odds, and his generous heart wanted to help. What he didn't see, what none of them saw until it was too late, was that Phyllis Turner was a predator who had been hunting for prey exactly like Raymond Washington. She'd done her research. She knew about the Washington family wealth, about the real estate empire, about the mansion in Buckhead and the trust funds and the legacy. She'd positioned herself at that charity auction specifically because she knew Raymond would be there, and she'd crafted her entire persona to appeal to his values and his vulnerabilities. The courtship was a whirlwind. Flowers arrived at Raymond's office every week. Weekend trips to Savannah and Charleston were planned with perfect attention to his tastes. Dinners at expensive restaurants always ended with Phyllis insisting on splitting the check, even though everyone knew she couldn't afford it, which made Raymond feel like she wasn't after his money. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and Raymond fell for every move. 8 months later, they were married in a small ceremony that Phyllis insisted on keeping intimate. She said she didn't want a big production, that she just wanted to start their new life together without fanfare. What she really wanted was to avoid too much scrutiny, too many people asking questions, too many background checks. Lorraine attended the wedding, but she pulled Dominique aside beforehand and said something that would echo in Dominique's mind for years afterward. Something about that woman doesn't sit right with me. Watch yourself, baby. I've been in business long enough to know when someone's running a game. But Dominique, who loved her father and wanted him to be happy, brushed off the warning. She told herself that her grandmother was just being overprotective, that Phyllis deserved a chance, that blending families was always awkward at first. Phyllis moved into the Buckhead mansion with her two daughters, Candace and Monique, and the cracks started showing immediately. Candace was 20 years old, pretty in a harsh way, and she had an entitlement problem that manifested in constant complaints. She was angry that her bedroom was smaller than Dominique's, angry that she had to share a bathroom with her sister, angry that Raymond's late wife's portrait still hung in the foyer. Monique was 17, quieter than her sister but no less calculating, and she spent her first week in the house cataloging every expensive item Dominique owned like she was taking inventory. Both girls had a habit of borrowing Dominique's clothes and returning them stained or torn. They'd use up her expensive makeup and perfume without asking, and when confronted, they'd shrug and say, "We're family now. What's yours is ours." Dominique was still living in the dorms at Spelman, only coming home on weekends, so she tried to let the small violations slide. She told herself it was an adjustment period, that things would settle down once everyone found their rhythm, but the small cruelties kept escalating. Phyllis started redecorating, which really meant erasing every trace of Chantal from the house. Photos disappeared. Belongings were donated to charity. The portrait in the foyer was replaced with a generic landscape painting. When Dominique protested to her father, Raymond said, "They're adjusting, sweetheart. It's hard blending families. Be patient." What none of them realized was that Phyllis was executing a long-term plan that had been in motion since the day she said, "I do." She was studying the family dynamics, identifying weaknesses, building leverage, and positioning herself for the moment when everything would shift in her favor. That moment came on a rainy November night when Raymond was driving home from a business trip to Savannah. A truck ran a red light and T-boned his car at an intersection. He died instantly. The police called at 11 at night, and Phyllis answered the phone. She screamed dramatically, making sure Candace and Monique heard her, making sure the neighbors heard her, making sure everyone would remember her performance. Then she called Dominique with a voice that was cold and flat, stripped of the fake warmth she usually performed. "Your father is dead. Get home now." No comfort, no compassion, just a command. Dominique drove home in her BMW, crying so hard she could barely see the road, nearly crashing 3 times because her body was shaking with sobs. When she arrived at the mansion, she found Phyllis already on the phone with lawyers. There were no tears on Phyllis's face. Just focus, just strategy, just the cold calculation of a woman who had been waiting for this moment. Dominique tried to call her grandmother, desperate for someone to hold her while she fell apart, but Phyllis had already called Lorraine first. Lorraine was in Dubai closing a major business deal, and the earliest she could return to Atlanta was 2 weeks away because of connecting flights and visa complications. On the phone, Lorraine was frantic. "Baby, I'm coming home as fast as I can. Are you okay? Is Phyllis taking care of you?" And Phyllis, standing close enough to hear both sides of the conversation, took the phone from Dominique's hand and said, in a voice dripping with false concern, "Don't worry, Lorraine. I'll handle everything here. I'm his wife. I've got this." Those 2 weeks between Raymond's death and Lorraine's return were when Phyllis made her move. She took complete control of the funeral arrangements, spending Raymond's money on an elaborate service with an expensive casket, and printed programs that featured photos of him with Phyllis and her daughters, with Dominique barely visible in the background. She went through Raymond's office systematically, accessing his computer, his files, his financial records, learning exactly how much money was in play and how she could get her hands on it. And she started isolating Dominique, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of friends and neighbors, telling anyone who would listen that the poor girl was so devastated, that she wasn't thinking clearly, that she was lashing out, that she was becoming difficult to manage. The week after the funeral, the family gathered in a lawyer's office for the reading of Raymond's will. The lawyer, an older black man who'd known the Washington family for decades, read the document with appropriate solemnity. Raymond had left the house to Phyllis, as was standard for a surviving spouse. He'd left Dominique a trust fund of $500,000, accessible when she turned 25, with all college expenses paid through graduation. It was a generous inheritance, carefully structured to protect a young woman who was still learning how the world worked. But there was more. Lorraine had set up separate accounts for Dominique that existed outside of Raymond's estate. There was the BMW, which had been a gift years earlier and was titled in Dominique's name. And there was a college fund of $200,000 that Lorraine had deposited into an account that only Dominique could access. The lawyer made a point of emphasizing this distinction. "These are direct gifts from Mrs. Lorraine Washington. They are not part of Raymond's estate, and they are solely for Dominique's benefit." Phyllis nodded along, squeezing Dominique's hand in a gesture that looked supportive but felt like a threat. Her grip was too tight, her nails digging into Dominique's palm hard enough to leave marks. And after the meeting in the parking lot where no one else could hear, Phyllis dropped her mask for just a moment. "Quite the golden girl, aren't you? Trust fund and grandmother's money must be nice." Dominique went back to Spelman, trying to hold herself together, but grief doesn't follow a schedule. She couldn't concentrate in class, couldn't focus on exams, couldn't remember why any of it mattered when her father was gone and the world felt like it had collapsed. She failed 2 exams for the first time in her life, and her professors, who knew about her father's death, offered her incompletes and extensions. But the failures felt like confirmation of what she'd been afraid of her whole life, that without her father she was going to fall apart. That's when she got a call from a neighbor, an older woman who'd lived next door to the Washingtons for 15 years. "Honey, I saw donation trucks at your house today. They were taking boxes and boxes of stuff. I thought you should know." Dominique's blood went cold. She jumped in her BMW and drove to Buckhead, her heart pounding, her mind racing through everything she'd left at the house. When she got there, she found Phyllis in the living room, looking calm and composed. Dominique demanded to know what had been donated, and Phyllis rattled off a list that made Dominique's knees buckle. All of her childhood belongings, photo albums with pictures of her mother, a woman she'd never gotten to meet but had built a relationship with through images and stories, her mother's jewelry that Raymond had carefully saved for her, pieces that Chantal had worn in the few photos that existed of her, awards and trophies from academic competitions, yearbooks filled with signatures from friends, memory boxes that held tickets from father-daughter dances and handwritten notes that Raymond had left on her pillow when she was scared or sad. All of it gone, donated to some charity thrift store where strangers were probably already rifling through the remnants of her entire childhood. When Dominique confronted Phyllis, the woman didn't even have the decency to look guilty. She said, "I'm grieving too. I needed to clear space. All of that stuff was triggering me. You're being selfish. You're not the only one who lost him." It was a perfectly crafted response designed to make Dominique feel guilty for her own pain, and it worked. Dominique backed down, too exhausted and grief-stricken to fight. She tried calling her grandmother, but Phyllis had been screening the calls, telling Lorraine that Dominique was going through a phase and needed space to process. When Dominique finally got through to her grandmother by calling the Washington Properties office line directly, Lorraine was furious. "I'm coming home early. Pack your things. You're moving in with me." But Lorraine was still 3 days away, and Phyllis knew she had to move fast. The next violation came quickly. Dominique came home for the weekend to find that her childhood bedroom had been redecorated for Monique. All of Dominique's remaining belongings had been shoved into boxes in the garage. Her posters were gone. Her furniture had been replaced. Her closet was full of Monique's clothes. When she protested, Phyllis said, "You're barely here anyway." "You live at school. Monique needs the bigger room for her things. Stop being so territorial." And Candace and Monique started wearing Dominique's designer clothes openly, taking her expensive makeup, using her perfume like it belonged to them. When Dominique objected, they'd laugh and say, "Mom said we're all family now. Sharing is caring." But the real nightmare started 2 nights before Lorraine was scheduled to return to Atlanta. Dominique was sleeping in the garage in what had basically become a storage room, and she woke up to the sound of arguing. Phyllis and her daughters were in the kitchen, and their voices were loud enough to carry through the walls. Dominique crept closer to listen, and what she heard made her blood run cold. Phyllis was saying, "That little brat has $200,000 sitting in an account, and we're supposed to struggle? I didn't marry Raymond and put up with his precious daughter for 3 years to walk away with nothing." Candace asked, "Can't you access it?" And Phyllis responded, "Not without her signature. But I'm working on it. I've got papers drawn up, power of attorney forms that'll give me control of everything. Once she signs, we can drain that account and disappear before Lorraine even knows what happened." Dominique pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. Everything suddenly made sense. The quick courtship, the rushed marriage, the fake sweetness, and the calculated cruelties. Phyllis had married Raymond for money, and now that he was dead, she was going after everything she could get her hands on, and Dominique was the only thing standing in her way. The next morning, Phyllis was overly sweet at breakfast, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. She said, "Dominique, honey, I know we've had some tension, I want us to start over. I want us to be a real family." She slid a stack of papers across the table. "These are just formalities, power of attorney documents that'll help me manage your accounts while you're grieving and focusing on school. Your grandmother suggested it. She thinks it would be helpful." It was a lie so blatant that Dominique almost laughed. Lorraine would never suggest giving Phyllis control of anything. Dominique pushed the papers back across the table and said, "No, I'm not signing anything, and I'm moving out when my grandmother gets here in 2 days." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Phyllis's smile disappeared, replaced by something ugly and raw. "Sign the papers, Dominique." Her voice had gone flat, all pretense of warmth evaporated. Dominique stood up from the table, her chair scraping against the floor. "No, and I'm calling my grandmother right now to tell her what you're really after." She turned to leave, but Candace and Monique were suddenly blocking the doorway. They'd been standing in the hall, listening, waiting for their cue. Dominique tried to push past them, but Candace grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise. "Where do you think you're going?" What happened next would become the nightmare that Dominique couldn't escape even years later. They dragged her back into the kitchen. Phyllis locked the door. And for the next hour, they made sure Dominique understood exactly how powerless she was. Phyllis hit her first, an open-handed slap that snapped Dominique's head to the side and left her ears ringing. Then Candace joined in, punching Dominique in the stomach hard enough to knock the wind out of her. Monique held Dominique's arms behind her back while Phyllis went to the stove and turned on the burner. She lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and then pressed the burning end into Dominique's ribs. The scream that tore out of Dominique's throat was inhuman, a sound of pure agony that she didn't know she was capable of making. Phyllis did it again, and again, and again. Each burn accompanied by words that were almost worse than the pain. "You think you're better than us? You think your grandmother's money makes you special? You're nothing, you're nobody, and when I'm done with you, everyone will know it." They took turns after that, belt across her back, knife shallow cuts on her stomach, not deep enough to be life-threatening but enough to scar, kicks to her ribs that broke bone. And through it all, Phyllis kept asking, "Will you sign the papers now?" Dominique refused. She didn't know where the strength came from, but she kept saying no, until her voice gave out, and all she could do was shake her head. Finally, when Dominique was barely conscious, they dragged her to the basement and locked her in. It was cold down there, concrete floors and unfinished walls, with only a thin blanket and a bottle of water that Phyllis tossed down the stairs like she was feeding a dog. Dominique lay on that floor for 3 days. She could hear them upstairs, living their lives, laughing, watching television, eating meals. Occasionally, Monique would come down with a piece of bread or another bottle of water, just enough to keep Dominique alive. On the 3rd day, Dominique noticed that one of the basement windows had a broken latch. It was small, barely big enough for her to squeeze through, but it was her only chance. She waited until the middle of the night, when the house was quiet, and then she pushed herself through that window, scraping her already injured body against the frame, leaving skin and blood on the concrete. She dropped onto the ground outside, barefoot and wearing only the pajamas she'd been sleeping in when this nightmare started, and then she ran. She ran through the Buckhead neighborhood in the dark, her broken ribs screaming with every step, her feet bleeding on the pavement. She knocked on neighbors' doors, but no one answered. Rich neighborhoods have high fences and privacy hedges and security systems, and no one wants to deal with someone who looks like trouble. She finally made it to a main road and flagged down a car, but the driver took one look at her, bloody, bruised, wild-eyed, and sped away. Eventually, she walked all the way to downtown Atlanta, a journey that took hours and left her feet shredded and her body on the verge of collapse. She found a payphone outside a gas station and called the police. An officer arrived 20 minutes later, and Dominique tried to explain what had happened. But when he ran her name in the system, his whole demeanor changed. "You're the girl who stole from her stepmother and had drugs in her car." Dominique felt the ground shift beneath her. "What? No, I didn't." But the officer cut her off. "There's a report here: theft, drug possession, and a restraining order. You're supposed to stay away from the family home." Phyllis had been busy during those 3 days. She'd filed a police report claiming that Dominique had stolen $10,000 in cash and attacked her. She'd planted drugs in the BMW and called the police to report it. And she'd gotten a restraining order granted in Dominique's absence, claiming that Dominique was violent and unstable. It was a perfect trap, built with lies and false evidence, and now Dominique was standing in front of a cop who already believed she was the criminal. "Go home and deal with your family issues," the officer said. "I don't want to see you again, or I'll arrest you for violating that restraining order." Dominique wanted to scream that she couldn't go home, that home was where people had tortured her, but the words wouldn't come. She was too exhausted, too broken, too defeated, so she walked away from that gas station with nowhere to go and no one to call. She spent her first night on the streets behind a closed restaurant, curled up next to a dumpster, and cried until she had no tears left. The next day, she tried to get help. She walked to Washington Properties headquarters, but security wouldn't let her in. She looked homeless, she had no ID, and when she tried to explain that she was Lorraine Washington's granddaughter, they thought she was running a scam. "Mrs. Washington is out of the country," they said, "and we don't let random people claim to be family." They escorted her out of the building like she was trash. She walked to Spelman College, hoping that someone there would recognize her, would help her, would believe her. But when she got to the administration building, she found out that she'd been withdrawn from school. Phyllis had called claiming to be Dominique's legal guardian and said that Dominique was dropping out due to personal issues. The financial aid office confirmed that the semester bill had gone unpaid, and her scholarship had been revoked for failing to meet academic standards after she'd missed finals. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd dreamed of, was gone. She tried to access her bank account, hoping to at least have money for food and shelter, but the account had been frozen. Phyllis had reported it as compromised and had it locked pending an investigation. Dominique had nothing: no money, no ID, no phone, no home, no education, no family except a grandmother who was on the other side of the world and didn't know she was missing. The first week on the streets was a crash course in survival. She learned which shelters had open beds and which ones had waiting lists months long. She learned which public parks would let you sleep without the police bothering you and which ones would have you arrested for trespassing. She learned how to spot the predators, the men who drove slowly through neighborhoods where homeless women gathered, offering money for things that Dominique refused to even think about. She learned how to make herself invisible, how to avoid eye contact, how to move through the world like a ghost. She found a spot behind a dumpster in West End, tucked away from the main street, where the owner of the grocery store didn't call the police as long as she stayed out of sight. She met other people living on the streets, and some of them were kind. A woman named Beverly, who was in her 50s and had lost everything to medical bills after a cancer diagnosis, took Dominique under her wing. Beverly shared food when she had it, showed Dominique where the clean public bathrooms were, and taught her how to wash up in gas station sinks without getting kicked out. "Baby girl, what happened to you?" Beverly asked one night when they were huddled together behind the dumpster trying to stay warm. Dominique couldn't answer. The shame was too heavy. How could she explain that she'd gone from a mansion to the streets in less than 2 weeks? How could she admit that she'd had everything and lost it all? So she just shook her head and said, "Family stuff." And Beverly, who understood that sometimes the past was too painful to speak out loud, didn't push. Dominique got a job at a fast food restaurant where the manager paid her under the table. She made $40 or $50 a day, which was barely enough for food, and she saved every penny she could because she thought that maybe, eventually, she'd have enough to get an ID and start rebuilding. But the system was designed to keep people trapped. You needed a birth certificate to get an ID, and the birth certificate cost $25. You needed an address to get an ID, but you couldn't get an address without money for rent, and you couldn't get a rental without an ID. It was a circular trap that had no exit, and Dominique was caught in the center of it. Months passed, then a year, then two. Dominique's body, which had never fully healed from Phyllis's attack, developed chronic pain. Her ribs ached constantly. The cigarette burn scarred over, leaving marks that would never fade. She got new injuries on the streets, bruises from fights over food, cuts from broken glass, infections that she couldn't afford to treat. Her mental health deteriorated. The depression was so heavy that some days she couldn't get out from behind the dumpster. She'd just lie there staring at the sky, wondering why she was still fighting to survive when survival felt like torture. She watched other young women on the streets disappear into trafficking rings or drug addiction, or just vanish one day and never come back. She attended makeshift funerals behind abandoned buildings, standing with strangers who'd become the only family she had, mourning people whose real names she didn't even know. On her 21st birthday, Dominique woke up behind the dumpster to the sound of garbage trucks and realized that no one in the world knew or cared that she'd survived another year. There was no cake, no candles, no singing, just another day of hunger and fear and shame. Beverly had gotten into a transitional housing program a few months earlier, and before she left, she'd tried to get Dominique into the program too. But there was only space for one person, and Beverly had prioritized herself because she was older and sicker. Dominique didn't blame her. She would have done the same thing. But it meant she was alone again, with no one to share the burden of survival. She made friends with a cook at a nearby diner who would sneak her leftover food. He was a middle-aged black man with kind eyes and a daughter who attended Clark Atlanta University. "You remind me of her," he said one day. "Smart, beautiful. You should be in school, not out here." Dominique smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, I should be a lot of things." She didn't tell him that she would have graduated from Spelman this year, that she would have been applying to medical schools, that she would have been Dr. Dominique Washington, instead of just another invisible homeless girl that people stepped over on the sidewalk. She saw her grandmother's empire everywhere. Washington Properties signs were all over Atlanta, announcing new developments and luxury condos and commercial spaces. Every time Dominique saw that name, she felt a stab of pain so acute that it took her breath away. Her grandmother was so close, probably working in her office just a few miles away, and yet she might as well have been on another planet. Dominique assumed that Lorraine had stopped looking for her, that she'd believed Phyllis's lies about the drug dealer and the running away. She assumed that Lorraine had moved on, had decided that Dominique wasn't worth the trouble, had written her off as a lost cause. What Dominique didn't know was that Lorraine had never stopped searching, that she'd hired private investigators who'd followed false leads across 3 states, that she'd filed missing persons reports and called in favors from police chiefs and business connections, that she'd offered reward money and put up flyers and done everything in her power to find her granddaughter. And what Dominique really didn't know was that Jerome, Lorraine's lead investigator, had finally gotten a tip from a homeless outreach worker. "There's a young black woman in West End, early 20s, calls herself Dee, has scars all over her body, speaks like she's educated, and she's been sleeping behind a dumpster for the past 2 years. Matches your description." Jerome had staked out the location for 3 days to confirm before he called Lorraine. When he finally sent her a photo of the woman sleeping behind the dumpster, Lorraine had broken down crying for the first time since her son's funeral. "That's my baby," she'd sobbed into the phone. "Oh God, that's my baby." And she'd gotten into her Rolls-Royce immediately, not caring that it was barely dawn, not caring that West End wasn't a neighborhood where cars like hers belonged, not caring about anything except getting to Dominique as fast as possible, which brought them back to this moment. Dominique in her grandmother's arms, wrapped in a blanket, being helped into the back of the Rolls-Royce while Jerome called ahead to the hospital. Lorraine sat next to Dominique, holding her hand, and the whole drive there, she whispered promises. "I've got you now, baby. I've got you, and I'm going to make them pay for what they did. I'm going to burn their whole world down." They went straight to Emory St. Joseph Hospital, where Dr. Mitchell, the Washington family physician for 30 years, was waiting. He did a full examination that took hours and documented everything. Malnutrition severe enough to have caused organ damage, untreated broken ribs that had healed incorrectly and would require surgery to fix, cigarette burns that were clearly intentional, not accidental, knife scars that formed patterns consistent with torture, not self-harm, PTSD symptoms that were severe enough to require immediate psychiatric intervention. Dr. Mitchell took photographs, wrote detailed notes, and when he was done, he sat down with Lorraine and said, "This is a criminal case. This is assault, battery, torture, and attempted murder. We need to report this to the police immediately." Lorraine's face was stone. "We will, but I'm handling this my way first. Those people are going to wish the police got to them before I did." She called Jerome, who was already working, while Dominique was sedated and finally sleeping in a clean bed. For the first time in 3 years, Jerome was digging through records and finding evidence that would destroy Phyllis Washington's entire world. He discovered that Phyllis had sold the BMW 2 days after Raymond's funeral for $35,000 cash. He found forged documents where Phyllis had faked Dominique's signature on power of attorney papers and drained the $200,000 college fund systematically over 3 years. He found bank statements showing how that money had been spent on cars for Candace and Monique, designer clothes, expensive vacations, and payment toward Phyllis's gambling debts. Jerome also found Phyllis's criminal history under her maiden name: fraud, identity theft, a restraining order from her first husband who'd accused her of stealing money from their joint accounts. Raymond had never known any of this because Phyllis had used a fake background check service and lied about her past. Candace had an arrest record too, assault and shoplifting from when she was 18. The whole family was built on lies and violence, and Raymond had walked right into their trap because he'd been lonely and kind and assumed that people were fundamentally good. Jerome also discovered that Phyllis had filed a false police report the day after Dominique escaped, claiming that Dominique had threatened her. She'd gotten a restraining order granted by telling a judge that Dominique was violent and dangerous. The order had been issued in Dominique's absence without her knowledge, which explained why the police hadn't helped her. There was a warrant out for violating a restraining order that Dominique didn't even know existed. It was a perfect legal trap designed to keep Dominique from getting help, from going to the authorities, from having any recourse at all. Phyllis had thought of everything, but she hadn't counted on Lorraine Washington. When Jerome presented his findings, Lorraine called her lawyers, a team that included the best criminal defense attorneys and civil litigation specialists in Georgia. "I want criminal charges filed: assault, battery, fraud, theft, forgery, false imprisonment, torture, and attempted murder. I want them arrested and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." But before that, Lorraine wanted them to feel what Dominique had felt. She wanted them to lose everything, so she made some calls. Washington Properties owned the building where Candace worked as a receptionist, and Lorraine had her fired that afternoon. She pulled strings at Georgia State University, where one of her foundations had funded a scholarship that Monique had fraudulently obtained using stolen information from Dominique's academic records. Monique was expelled within 24 hours. Lorraine had their bank accounts frozen pending fraud investigations. She had their credit cards canceled. She had Phyllis's car, which had been purchased with money stolen from Dominique, repossessed while Phyllis was at the grocery store. Within one day, Phyllis and her daughters went from living comfortably off stolen money to having nothing. Their phones started ringing with collection agencies. Their electricity got shut off because they couldn't pay the bill. Their entire world came crashing down, and they had no idea what was happening or who was behind it. Phyllis tried calling lawyers, but no one would take her case. Once they heard the name Lorraine Washington, she tried going to the police, but the police were suddenly very interested in the fraud allegations against her. She tried accessing money from Raymond's estate, but Lorraine's lawyers had already filed paperwork, freezing everything pending litigation. Phyllis was trapped, and she didn't even fully understand how tightly the net had closed around her. A week later, when Dominique was finally conscious and lucid, she woke up in a bedroom that she didn't recognize. For a moment, panic seized her. Where was she? Who had taken her? Was she in danger? But then she saw her grandmother sitting in a chair beside the bed, and reality came flooding back. "Grandmother?" Her voice was hoarse from disuse. Lorraine smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Dominique had seen in years. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here, and I'm never letting you go again." Dominique started crying. "I'm so sorry. I lost everything you gave me. The car, the money, the education. I failed you." Lorraine moved to the bed and gathered Dominique in her arms. "Hush now, you didn't lose anything. It was stolen from you, and we're taking it all back." She explained everything that Jerome had discovered, and Dominique listened in numb shock. Phyllis had planned the entire thing from the beginning. She targeted Raymond specifically, married him for his money, waited for him to die, and then eliminated the only obstacle between her and the Washington fortune. "She thought she'd won," Lorraine said. "She thought she'd gotten away with it. But she forgot one thing. I built an empire in this city, and I don't lose." 2 weeks later, Dominique was strong enough to face Phyllis. She told Lorraine that she needed to do this, that she needed to look her abuser in the eye and show her that she'd survived. Lorraine arranged a meeting at the lawyer's office, and when Phyllis arrived, she was still arrogant. She brought her own lawyer, a public defender who looked overworked and underpaid, and she walked in like she was about to negotiate a settlement. But then she saw Dominique sitting at the conference table, clean and healthy and very much alive, and the color drained from her face. She tried to recover, tried to put on the concerned stepmother act one more time. "Dominique, thank God, we've been so worried." But Dominique cut her off. She stood up, walked around the table, and lifted her shirt to show the scars. "You did this to me. You and your daughters held me down and burned me with cigarettes because I wouldn't sign your papers." Phyllis started to protest, but Jerome pressed play on a recording. It was audio from a phone call between Phyllis, Candace, and Monique from 2 years ago, discussing how they'd taught that little brat a lesson and how they needed to make sure she never comes back. The recording was damning. Phyllis's lawyer stood up, said, "I'm withdrawing from this case," and walked out of the room without another word. Phyllis's mask finally cracked. "You can't prove anything. I'm his wife. Raymond left me that house." Lorraine leaned forward, and her voice was colder than Dominique had ever heard it. "The house Raymond left you was paid for with a loan from Washington Properties. I own the note, and I'm calling it due. You have 30 days to vacate, or I'll have the sheriff remove you myself. Phyllis's eyes went wild. You can't do this. But Lorraine wasn't done. Criminal charges are being filed today. Assault, battery, kidnapping, fraud, theft, forgery, identity theft, and attempted murder. My lawyers estimate 15 to 20 years in prison for each of you. Jerome added, Candace and Monique are being arrested as we speak. Officers are at their locations now. And right on cue, Phyllis's phone started buzzing with calls from her daughters. She looked at the screen, looked at Lorraine, and for the first time she seemed to understand that she'd lost. Dominique felt nothing watching Phyllis fall apart. No satisfaction, no anger, just a profound exhaustion and a desire for this nightmare to finally be over. You're going to pay for what you did, Dominique said quietly, not because I want revenge, but because other people need to see that monsters like you don't win. Phyllis was arrested that afternoon at the Buckhead mansion, led out in handcuffs while news crews filmed. Jerome had tipped off the media and the story went viral within hours. Billionaire's granddaughter found after 3 years homeless. Step-family arrested for torture and fraud. The community was outraged. The comment sections were filled with people demanding the harshest sentences possible. The trial happened 6 months later, and it was a media circus. Dominique took the stand and testified about everything: the abuse, the torture, the 3 years on the streets, the system failures that had left her invisible and voiceless. She showed her scars to the jury, and several people in the courtroom started crying. The defense tried to paint Dominique as a troubled young woman who'd made bad choices, but the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, forged signatures, audio recordings, medical documentation, security footage from the bank showing Phyllis cashing checks that didn't belong to her. The jury deliberated for 2 hours, guilty on all counts. The sentencing was swift. Phyllis got 18 years. Candace got 12. Monique got 10. The judge, an older black woman who'd worked her way up from public defender to the bench, looked at Phyllis with pure disgust. You took a young woman who had everything ahead of her and tried to destroy her for money. You tortured her. You threw her into the streets like garbage. And you did it all without an ounce of remorse. You deserve every single day of this sentence. As Phyllis was led away screaming, Dominique felt something inside her shift. It wasn't closure exactly. The pain didn't disappear, but it was acknowledgement. The system that had failed her had finally seen her, believed her, and acted. That had to be enough. The healing process was slow and painful and non-linear. Dominique moved into Lorraine's estate permanently, and her grandmother made sure she had access to the best therapists, doctors, and support systems available. 3 times a week, Dominique sat in therapy sessions where she slowly unpacked the trauma and learned coping mechanisms for the PTSD that made her wake up screaming some nights. She did physical therapy for her injuries, and while the pain would never fully go away, it became manageable. She joined a support group for abuse survivors, and for the first time, she didn't feel alone. She met other women who'd survived similar nightmares, and they held each other up on the days when living felt impossible. Lorraine was patient and loving and present in a way that saved Dominique's life. On the bad days, when Dominique couldn't get out of bed, Lorraine would sit with her and say, "Healing isn't linear, baby. Some days you'll feel strong. Some days you'll feel broken. Both are okay. You're allowed to feel everything." And slowly, painfully, the light started coming back to Dominique's eyes. She started smiling again. She started believing that maybe, just maybe, she deserved to take up space in the world. A year after her rescue, Dominique was ready to think about her future again. Lorraine asked her gently, "What do you want, baby? No pressure, no expectations, just dreams." Dominique thought about it for a long time before answering. I still want to be a doctor. I still want to help children. I know I'm behind. I know it'll take longer now, but I think I need to do this for me and for the girl I was before all of this happened. Lorraine smiled and made some calls. Spelman College welcomed Dominique back with open arms. The dean personally apologized for not investigating when Dominique had disappeared, and the school reinstated her full scholarship. Her credits were honored and she was able to enroll as a junior. At 24 years old, Dominique walked back onto campus, and it felt like coming home. Her classmates had heard her story, and instead of treating her like a victim, they treated her like a survivor. Professors were supportive and accommodating, understanding that Dominique needed extra time sometimes because of therapy appointments or bad mental health days. And Dominique thrived. She threw herself into her studies with a focus that surprised even her. She made the dean's list. She joined pre-med study groups. And she discovered a new passion, pediatric trauma surgery. She wanted to help children who'd experienced violence, who'd been broken by the people who were supposed to protect them, who needed someone to see them and fight for them. She wanted to be for them what Dr. Mitchell had been for her. Dominique also never forgot Beverly, the homeless woman who'd shared food and taught her how to survive on the streets. Jerome located Beverly in a transitional housing program, and Dominique went to visit her with bags full of groceries, clothes, and practical supplies. When Beverly opened the door and saw Dominique standing there, healthy and whole, she burst into tears. "Baby girl, look at you. I knew you were special. I knew you'd make it out." They hugged for a long time, and Dominique said, "You saved my life. You kept me human when I wanted to disappear. I'll never forget that." She used her grandmother's resources to help Beverly get permanent housing and job training, and Lorraine hired Beverly personally to work at Washington Properties. Beverly became an advocate for homeless women, using her own experience to help others navigate the system. She thrived in her new role, and watching her succeed gave Dominique almost as much joy as her own recovery. It proved something that Dominique had needed to believe, that it was possible to rebuild after losing everything, that survival could lead to thriving, that the end of one story could be the beginning of another. Dominique also created a foundation called Second Chance Scholars. It was designed to help young people who'd experienced homelessness get access to education. The foundation provided housing, tuition assistance, counseling, job training, and mentorship. Lorraine funded it generously with a $10 million initial investment, and within the first year they'd helped 50 students. By the third year, they were serving 200 students across Georgia. Dominique spoke at fundraising events and shared her story without shame or hesitation. She talked about sleeping behind dumpsters, about feeling invisible, about the system failures that trapped people in cycles of poverty. And her advocacy made a difference. She testified before the state legislature about gaps in homeless youth services, and laws were changed because of her testimony. Programs were funded, resources were allocated, and young people who might have fallen through the cracks were caught by safety nets that Dominique had helped build. She became a voice for an invisible population, and she used her platform to force society to confront uncomfortable truths about how we treat our most vulnerable citizens. When Dominique graduated from Spelman, summa cum laude, Lorraine was in the front row crying tears of pride. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered during their hug afterward. "Your mother too." Dominique kept photos of both her parents on her desk through medical school, which she attended at Emory University, one of the top programs in the country. Medical school was brutal. Long hours, constant stress, pressure that would have broken a weaker person. But Dominique had already survived the worst thing that could happen to her. Compared to sleeping behind a dumpster, medical school exams felt manageable. She studied relentlessly and finished at the top of her class. During her rotations in the pediatric emergency room, she saw children who reminded her of herself, broken, scared, hurt by people who should have protected them. She treated each one with dignity and compassion, and she became their advocate, making sure social workers were called, making sure police reports were filed, making sure no child fell through the cracks the way she had. Her professors noticed her special gift with traumatized children and wrote glowing recommendations. On match day, when medical students find out where they'll do their residency, Dominique opened her envelope with shaking hands. Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, pediatric surgery residency. Her dream was coming true. 5 years after her rescue, when Dominique was 28 years old and thriving as a medical resident, she got a call from a police officer. A young woman had been found behind the same dumpster where Dominique had been discovered. She was 19, black, injured, and refusing to go to the hospital because she didn't trust anyone. The officer said, "She reminds me of your case, Dr. Washington. Would you be willing to come talk to her?" Dominique didn't hesitate. She drove to West End, back to the spot that still haunted her nightmares. And when she saw the girl curled up behind the dumpster, she felt like she was looking at her own ghost. She approached slowly, hands visible, making herself small and non-threatening. "Hey, my name is Dominique. I used to sleep right where you are." The girl looked up, eyes full of suspicion and fear. Dominique sat down on the ground beside her, not caring that her nice clothes were getting dirty. "I know you don't trust anyone. I know you think no one cares. I know you feel invisible." The girl's lip started trembling. "My mom's boyfriend kicked me out, said I was stealing from him. I wasn't. I swear I wasn't." Dominique believed her instantly. "I believe you. Come with me. Let's get you somewhere safe, get you fed, and figure this out together. You don't have to be alone anymore." The girl took Dominique's hand, and in that moment Dominique understood her purpose. This was why she'd survived. This was why she'd endured 3 years of hell and fought her way back to life. So she could be the person she needed when she was behind that dumpster. So she could see the invisible people and remind them that they mattered. The girl's name was Talia, and Dominique got her into the Second Chance Scholars Program that same day. She made sure Talia had housing, therapy, and a path forward. And 6 months later, when Talia enrolled in community college with dreams of becoming a social worker, Dominique was there cheering her on. This became a pattern. Dominique would get calls about young people in crisis, and she'd show up. She'd sit with them, believe them, and help them find their way out of the darkness. Each person she helped was a middle finger to Phyllis and everyone who'd tried to erase her. Each life she touched was proof that she'd turned her pain into purpose. The final scene of Dominique's story happened at a gala for the Second Chance Scholars Foundation. The ballroom was packed with donors, advocates, politicians, and success stories. Beverly was there, now the director of homeless outreach. Talia was there, about to graduate with her associate's degree. Dozens of other scholarship recipients filled the room. College students, graduate students, young professionals who'd all been homeless once and were now thriving. Dominique took the stage to speak, and Lorraine sat in the front row, with tears already streaming down her face. 5 years ago, Dominique began, I was sleeping behind a dumpster in West End. I'd lost everything, my home, my education, my identity, my hope. I was invisible. Society had decided I didn't matter. The room was silent. But one person refused to stop looking for me. My grandmother taught me that love doesn't give up, that family fights for each other, that money means nothing if you don't use it to lift others. She showed a slide, a photograph that Jerome had taken the morning they found her behind the dumpster. The crowd gasped at the contrast between that broken girl and Dr. Dominique Washington standing confidently on stage. This is why we fight. For every young person who thinks they're invisible, For every child society throws away, we see you, we believe you, and we will fight for you. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Lorraine joined Dominique on stage and hugged her tight. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered. "You took your pain and turned it into purpose." Dominique whispered back, "I learned from the best, grandmother. You taught me that survival isn't enough. We have to thrive, and we have to bring others with us." After the gala, they walked to the car together, passing a construction site where a new building was going up. The sign read, "Future home of Second Chance Scholars Center, 200-unit housing complex for homeless youth with education programs, medical clinic, and job training." Dominique looked at it and felt a swell of pride. "Think it's too ambitious?" Lorraine laughed. "Baby, we don't do small dreams in this family. We change the world." They drove through Atlanta together, through the city that had watched Dominique fall and rise. They passed West End, where a mural now covered the wall near the dumpster. Beverly had organized a community art project, and local artists had painted a sunrise with words underneath. "From darkness to light, there is always hope." Dominique saw it and felt tears prick her eyes. "I survived, grandmother. We survived." Lorraine reached over and squeezed her hand. "No, baby. You didn't just survive. You soared." If this story moved you, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because these stories need to be told. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have resources, donate to homeless youth programs in your city. Right now, thousands of young people are living the nightmare that Dominique survived. They're sleeping behind dumpsters, under bridges, in abandoned buildings, and they're invisible to most of society. Many of them have families looking for them. Many of them escaped abuse. All of them deserve a second chance. Comment below and tell me what you would do if you found your loved one living on the streets. This is more than entertainment. This is a call to action, because everyone has a story. Everyone deserves dignity, and love, real love, never stops looking. Until next time, remember that the measure of our humanity is how we treat people when they have nothing left to offer us. Peace.